49 seconds. We'll get the numbers on Trump's shortly. Let's dive into the detail, though, of what was said by the US president. Delighted to say I'm now joined here on LBC News by Erol Morkoç, a Republican strategist and spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. Thanks very much for joining us, Erol. What did you make of what the president had to say to Congress?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And it really was vintage Trump. It was Trump coming in and he was speaking to the country which had given him a mandate. And he gave a lot of overtures across the board. So I think the biggest takeaway at first was that if you were a middle of the road or centrist voter who was voted for Donald Trump based on common sense policies, as he touts it, you heard a lot more of that. You heard him touch on the fact that he's going to start his first war against the cartels who've been poisoning American children and American people and are responsible for all of the overdose deaths. You saw him touch on ending the participation of men in women's sports, and he brought that beautiful young lady who suffered a severe brain damage from volleyball game, and you saw the support you had going on there. So I think there was a lot of social issues that Donald Trump brought to the forefront. He touched on his tariffs, and he mentioned, that there will be a little bit of pain at first, but I think it's for the good of the nation. And I think in the first 100 days, he's gotten so much done in the first 40 that we forget to give him at least the grace of the first 100 to work some things out. I think his timing with Zelensky, say, backing down, not that it was that much of a real confrontation, if you think about it, it was more made for the cameras, but that timed out really well for him to point that, he's going to bring peace in Russia. And you saw the Democrats didn't clap for certain things that would be like peace-related things. And that's a very different Democrat Party than the one when I was a kid, which was the anti-war party. They also didn't clap for the kid who had brain cancer, which didn't seem to be necessary. That seemed like a very sweet moment. So there was some contention in the room. But for the most part, Donald Trump, he read the room well. People at home, I think, are going to respond very strongly to it. And I think that in the end, Donald Trump was Donald Trump. And this is like the return of a great American statesman. This was his moment to come out, be presidential as he always is. He had a very nice, neutral burgundy color tie, I want to note. Seemed a very good choice for the optics. Everything was well set up and well staged.
Were you surprised at the level of protest from the Democrats, holding signs and banners and placards, and some of them dressing in pink, and even one having to be ejected? I've covered lots of State of the Unions, and I don't remember somebody being ejected from the House floor.
I don't really remember anybody ever being ejected. I forgot his name, but I think
Al Green.
Al Green, yeah.
He's a Democrat from Texas.
Yeah, and he's exercising his First Amendment right there, and he certainly was asked to leave, obviously for decorum reasons. I would actually say I was impressed at their restraint. They were able to keep it to placards and signs that basically they held up, calling Trump a liar, the whole speech. At least that's. I think that's a little bit rude, but Donald Trump is maybe a kinder-hearted person than I am. Doesn't take things as personal. So they protested, but I think they actually were pretty respectful, all in all, considering how divergent their opinion of what America is compared to ours. Like, we promised demonstrable change in this country to the American voter, and that change was a 180 from everything that they believe in. So I can understand and feel their pain as a fellow American, but I hope that they would, at least come around and clap for certain things that were bipartisan issues, and they didn't do that. That's what stood out more, and that's going to stand out more to the independent voter or the moderate centrist voter who's watching this, and he's seeing the Democrats not stand up for the people who are killed by cartels or the kid with brain cancer. You can't stand up for him. You're that divided. So I think that's maybe the only takeaway there. It wasn't awful, and I think Al Green probably put that plan to do that. It's his sort of showboat kind of personality. That's kind of the kind of politician he plays himself out to be. He's very boisterous.
On some of the topics that Trump touched on, obviously one of the hot topics is tariffs. You mentioned that he talked about the little disturbance ahead. What you've seen so far in America hasn't been a little disturbance. Some of those markets being down 1.5%, that's huge a loss to American financial markets. How do you think they might be when they wake up tomorrow? How do you think investors will be following that speech?
I think they're going to be confident, and I think it's also important to recognize that only 1 out of 10 Americans holds a significant portion of stock. 9 out of 10 Americans don't have any vested interest in this stock market. So the short-term movement in financial markets or in commodity pricing...
But there's a lot of pensions in the S&P 500.
There are a lot of pensions. That's true, and that's a fair point. And any sort of drawdown does raise eyebrows, but let's see how quickly this trade war ends. The U.S. has all of the cards here, especially regarding Canada and Mexico, and the only thing we're asking for effectively is to go to war with the cartels and perhaps a few concessions. I think Donald Trump's looking for a deal. He's looking for a deal with Detroit automakers. He wants them to build their factories in the U.S., not directly across the border in Mexico. And these are the kind of things that Bernie Sanders originally fought for 10, 15 years ago. I mean, you're supposed to protect the American worker, and the American worker is some of the people who have these pension plans. So the stock market, is an important thing, but it's also not the only barometer of success. And I don't think that most of the Trump voting people are incredibly worried short term. I think investors are going to wake up very bullish tomorrow. You saw a confident, ebullient president who had just gotten concessions in the mining rare earth deal with Zelensky. And I think if you look at international financial markets, the war in Ukraine, that's been much more destabilizing, especially for things such as aluminium prices or grain prices. That's where you start to see these global effects. So if that stability is kind of worked out, I think you're going to have a lot more confidence. Then, also consider this. We import maybe 2 to 3% of our GDP from Canada and Mexico. They export to us 30% of their GDP. So imagine the buyer of all the apples wants a different price and you don't have any other buyers. The buyer's going to win. Maybe a few days and some tears before bedtime, but they're going to come around.
Obviously, went quite heavy on the situation in Ukraine and wanting the war to stop there at the end of his speech. There wasn't a huge amount said by Trump on the situation in the Middle East, Gaza, Israel.
That was a notable omission, and I have to think that based on my sources, that's because there's a lot of work being done behind closed doors, especially with the financial involvement of the Saudis and of the Gulf states in trying to rectify the situation in Gaza. I'm the first to admit when Donald Trump comes out and says Gaza is America, myself and nobody has any idea what he's talking about. And that in itself resets the paradigm of how you're going to negotiate this. Because now it created a interesting moment for everybody that like, okay, that's different, but wait a second, we want to have a say in this. And that's why there isn't a lot being reported, because on the back end, there is plans being put together for a huge financial ticket for resettlement, for new cities, for rebuilding, and for eventually repatriating at least valid people who aren't terrorists back to a new Gaza. And that, I think, is something that Donald Trump is keeping very closed doors. So it's a good thing to bring up. That was a glaring omission from tonight's speech.
Well, really good to talk to you, Erol. Thanks very much for joining us here on LBC News. That's Erol Morkoç, a Republican strategist and spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK.